Ladies and gentlemen, what if I told you that everything you've been taught about being a good person might be missing the point? What if morality, the great force that shapes our actions, our society, and our sense of right and wrong, is not what we think it is? That maybe, just maybe, the highest form of morality isn't about rules, commandments, or obligations, but something far more spontaneous, effortless, and even joyful, because that's exactly what mystics throughout history have hinted at. From Zen masters laughing in the face of logic to Sufi poets whirling in ecstatic surrender, the message is the same. The deepest morality doesn't come from fear of punishment or hope for reward. It flows naturally when you see reality as it truly is. And if that's true, it changes everything. Stay with me, because by the end of this talk, you might never look at morality the same way again. We tend to think of morality as a rigid framework, a set of rules that must be followed to maintain order. Meanwhile, mysticism is seen as something wild, untamed, even dangerously free. One is about responsibility, the other about liberation. And so people assume they are opposites. But this is like believing that the ocean and the waves are separate. The mystical experience is not about breaking morality. It's about transcending the illusion that morality is something imposed from the outside. Why do we follow moral codes? Is it because we genuinely feel connected to others, or because we fear judgment? Most people obey out of conditioning taught from childhood that goodness is a checklist and that virtue is something you earn. But a mystic sees through this. They don't act out of obligation. They don't need rules to tell them to be compassionate. Their morality is natural, like a tree giving shade without asking for anything in return. The moment you see yourself as part of everything, kindness is no longer an effort, it's automatic. But wait, some might say, if morality is spontaneous, won't society fall into chaos? But look closely. Is it the people who feel truly connected to the universe who cause destruction? Or is it those ruled by fear, guilt, and the desperate need to control others? History is filled with examples of moral systems used as tools of oppression. A truly mystical morality does not come from fear of punishment. It arises from clarity. When you see the world without illusion, you don't need to be told not to harm others. You see that harming others is the same as harming yourself. Imagine morality not as a law, but as a dance. When musicians play together, do they need a rule book telling them when to listen and when to lead? No. They feel the rhythm, they move with the flow. This is how morality works at its highest level, not as a rigid doctrine, but as a deep attunement to life itself. When you are awake to reality, you don't need external commandments. Your actions become effortless expressions of harmony. So here's the paradox. The most moral person is not the one who tries the hardest to be good. It is the one who has ceased trying altogether, because they have seen the illusion of separateness dissolve. When you wake up, when you see beyond the illusion of self and other, you don't need morality imposed upon you. You are morality itself, because morality is simply the natural expression of a being in tune with reality. And that, my friends, is the secret that mystics have known for ages, that true goodness is not something you achieve, it is something you remember. Oh, can you see it? The moment you try to be selfless, you are no longer truly selfless. This is the great paradox that lies at the heart of morality. We are taught from an early age that being a good person means suppressing selfish desires, sacrificing for others, and adhering to a moral code. But the very act of trying to be good implies an agenda, an effort to prove one's worth, be seen as virtuous, or to earn some reward, whether in this life or the next. In doing so, morality becomes a performance, a transaction, rather than a spontaneous expression of wisdom. Mysticism, on the other hand, suggests that true selflessness is not something you cultivate, but something that arises naturally when the illusion of the separate self dissolves. A mystic does not strive to be selfless because, from their perspective, the self was never truly separate from the whole. The river does not force itself to flow toward the ocean. It simply moves as part of the greater cycle of water. Similarly, when one sees reality as it is, without the artificial boundaries of self and other, kindness, generosity, and compassion cease to be moral duties and become as natural as breathing. The problem with conventional morality is that it often reinforces the very ego it seeks to transcend. A person who prides themselves on being virtuous, who constantly measures their goodness against some external standard, is still deeply entangled in the self-centered mindset. Even their selflessness becomes a form of self-preservation, an attempt to secure an identity as a good person. True selflessness, as seen through the mystical lens, is not about denying oneself for the sake of others, nor is it about obliterating individuality. It is the effortless recognition that there was never a fundamental separation to begin with. A bird does not sing because it wishes to please the forest. It sings because that is its nature. Likewise, a truly selfless act is one that arises without calculation, without a sense of duty, but simply because it is the most natural response to the moment. Morality often feels like a structure imposed upon us, a system of rules carefully constructed to prevent chaos, to keep society in order, and to ensure that human beings behave in a way that is deemed acceptable. But underneath this carefully laid framework lies a deep fear, the fear that without rules, without control, people will descend into selfishness, violence, and destruction. We create laws, ethical doctrines, and religious commandments because we believe that without them, something dark within us will take over. Yet mysticism whispers something entirely different, that the very need for control is the root of the problem, and that true morality is not imposed from the outside, but arises from a profound understanding of our interconnectedness with all things. When we examine the most rigid moral structures, we find that they are often driven by fear rather than wisdom. People obey because they are afraid of punishment, of rejection, of divine wrath, or of social consequences. But fear-based morality is brittle. It does not transform the heart. It merely conditions behavior. The one who does good out of fear is not truly good, only compliant. Mysticism, on the other hand, dismantles this illusion by showing that morality is not about control, but about awareness. When you deeply see the nature of existence, when you perceive the interconnected fabric of life, you do not need commandments telling you to love your neighbor. You are your neighbor. To harm them is to harm yourself. And this is not an intellectual conclusion. It is a direct experience. Ironically, the more we attempt to control morality, the more we stifle the natural flow of compassion and wisdom. Like a river forced into a narrow canal, morality under rigid control loses its organic movement, becoming something cold and lifeless. But left to its natural course, free from imposed restrictions, morality flows not from duty, but from a deep and spontaneous harmony with life itself. The need for control dissolves, and with it the very fear that made control seem necessary in the first place. Morality, as we often conceive of it, is a rigid system of rules, a structure designed to keep human behavior in check, to ensure that people act in ways that are socially acceptable, ethical, and just. But mysticism reveals a different perspective, one in which morality is not an imposed framework, but a natural flow, a rhythm woven into the fabric of existence itself. The mistake we make is believing that goodness must be enforced, that without strict guidelines, people will collapse into chaos and self-indulgence. Yet, when we observe the natural world, we do not see moral laws dictating the way the trees grow, the rivers flow, or the stars move across the sky. There is no external force commanding a bird to fly or a flower to bloom. It all happens effortlessly in accordance with the nature of things. And if we look deeply, we might recognize that human morality at its highest form works in the same way. When musicians play together in a great symphony, they do not stop to consult rule books or force themselves to stay in rhythm. They feel it, they listen to each other, they sense the flow of the music, and they move with it. This is what true morality looks like, not a burden, not a set of imposed obligations, but an intuitive harmony with the ever-changing dance of life. The problem with structured morality is that it often removes this sense of spontaneity, replacing it with rigid expectations, artificial guilt, and fear-driven obedience. People become so caught up in following the right path that they forget to listen to the music of the present moment. But the mystic sees morality differently. To them, goodness is not a duty, it is a natural movement, like the current of a river or the swaying of trees in the wind. It is not something they struggle to achieve, but something that arises effortlessly when they are in tune with the great dance of existence. And in that attunement, there is no longer a need for rigid control, only the graceful unfolding of life in perfect balance. Morality has always been presented as a battle between good and evil, a clear distinction between right and wrong. From childhood, we are taught that virtuous actions lead to reward, while wrongdoing leads to punishment. Societies create systems of justice to reinforce these boundaries, ensuring that people adhere to an accepted moral code. But mysticism unsettles this entire structure by suggesting that morality is not a set of external laws, but an organic, evolving process that shifts as our awareness deepens. It challenges the notion that good and evil are absolute categories, instead revealing that what we call moral often depends on culture, time, and perception. What one civilization condemns, another celebrates. What was considered sinful in the past is embraced in the present. If morality were absolute, how could it be so fluid? This does not mean that morality is meaningless or that anything goes, but rather that our moral judgments are often shaped by a limited perspective. Mysticism invites us to step beyond this perspective, to see morality not as a rigid system, but as an expression of our relationship with reality. When you look deeply into life, you begin to see that actions are neither inherently good nor evil. They arise from ignorance or from awareness. A person who harms others is not acting out of some cosmic evil force, but from a state of separation, of blindness to the interconnected nature of existence. The more one awakens to this interconnectedness, the more natural compassion becomes, not because one is following rules, but because it is impossible to do otherwise. The greatest irony is that those who try hardest to be good often do so out of fear. Fear of judgment, fear of consequences, fear of not measuring up to an ideal. But mysticism dissolves this fear by revealing that morality is not something imposed from the outside, but something that flows naturally when one sees reality clearly. In this way, true goodness is not about obeying commandments or striving to be virtuous. It is about moving beyond the illusion of good and evil and acting from a place of deep, effortless wisdom. For centuries, people have struggled with the tension between mysticism and morality, as if they were opposing forces. Morality is seen as the necessary structure that holds society together, a set of rules to prevent chaos and guide human behavior. Mysticism, on the other hand, appears lawless, boundless, unconcerned with conventions, and indifferent to prescribed notions of right and wrong. The moralist fears that mysticism leads to irresponsibility, while the mystic sees moral systems as artificial constructs, often rooted in fear rather than genuine understanding. But is this divide real, or is it merely an illusion created by misunderstanding? Both. The moralist believes that without strict guidelines, people will act purely on impulse, potentially harming others in the process. But what is the foundation of this belief? It assumes that without external control, human nature is inherently selfish, destructive, or chaotic. Yet when we look at nature, we do not see such chaos. The trees do not need a law to provide oxygen, the river does not require commandments to flow, and the sun does not shine because it was told to do so. Everything moves in accordance with its nature. What if morality at its highest level functions in the same way, not as a forced discipline, but as an effortless alignment with the flow of existence? The mystic understands this intuitively. They do not require a set of external rules to dictate compassion, generosity, or kindness, because these qualities arise naturally when one sees the interconnectedness of all things. The moralist, however, operates from the assumption that people must be trained to be good, that morality must be instilled through laws, doctrines or fear of consequences. Yet history has shown us that many of the greatest moral failures were not caused by a lack of rules, but by blind adherence to them. Wars have been fought in the name of morality. Oppression has been justified by rigid ethical codes. When morality is driven by fear and control, rather than by direct perception of reality, it becomes rigid, lifeless, and often dangerous. Mysticism does not reject morality. It transcends its limitations, revealing that true goodness is not about obedience, but about deep understanding. From the moment we are old enough to understand language, we are taught that morality is something we must obey, something enforced by laws, religion, or society. We are warned that if we do not follow the moral path, we will suffer, either in this life or the next. Fear becomes the driving force behind our sense of right and wrong. We fear punishment, judgment, and exclusion. Even our acts of kindness are often tainted by this fear as we seek approval, redemption, or security. But mysticism reveals something radical, that true morality cannot be based on fear. The moment an action is motivated by fear, it is no longer an expression of real goodness. It is a reaction, a survival instinct wrapped in the language of virtue. A mystic does not act morally because they are afraid of consequences, nor because they believe they should. They act with compassion, not because a rule tells them to, but because they see no separation between themselves and others. Fear-based morality creates anxiety, guilt, and hypocrisy. It turns goodness into an obligation rather than a natural way of being. Mysticism dissolves this fear by revealing the illusion of the separate self. When you understand that you are not a rigid, isolated being, but part of an interconnected whole, morality ceases to be a struggle. You do not need to force yourself to be kind any more than you need to force yourself to breathe. Kindness, generosity, and love emerge as effortlessly as waves in the ocean. Fearless morality is not reckless or lawless. In fact, it is the only morality that is truly reliable. A person who acts out of fear may do good when watched, but turn selfish when unseen. A person who acts from deep understanding has no need for external control, for their actions arise naturally from a place of wisdom. To live without fear is not to abandon morality, but to embody it in its purest form, free from guilt, free from coercion, and free from the illusion that goodness must be imposed rather than discovered. The greatest irony of morality is that the harder we try to enforce it, the more artificial it becomes. When goodness is reduced to obligation, it loses its vitality, becoming something performed rather than lived. Mysticism shatters this illusion by revealing that morality is not a rigid framework to be followed, but a natural expression of understanding. The moment you see beyond the illusion of separateness, when you no longer view yourself as isolated from others, from nature, from the universe itself, morality ceases to be a struggle. Kindness, compassion, and wisdom flow effortlessly, like a river moving toward the sea, not because it is commanded to, but because that is its nature. True morality does not come from fear, nor does it require control. It arises spontaneously from deep perception, from an awakened awareness of life's interconnected dance. The mystic does not ask, what is the right thing to do, but simply acts in harmony with the whole. And in that harmony there is no conflict between mysticism and morality, only a seamless, effortless movement toward wisdom and love.